you probably want to build an ADU, or you know somebody who's interested in building a granny flat. And so this is the handbook that the HCD put out. And I'm going to go through some of the things that surprised me, some of the really important clarifications, and by the end of this video, you're going to have an updated sense of the rules as they're being interpreted by the state government. And there's some big surprises in there. Homeowners can have a 3,000 square foot ADU. They literally use the number 3,000 square feet. In September, the state government in California answered a lot of really important questions about the rules that let people build granny flats or accessory dwelling units in their backyards. To be clear, the state hasn't passed any new laws since the ones that went into effect in January 2020. But there were a lot of questions about how those laws interact and how they should actually be implemented by local cities, counties, and other agencies. So if you're a homeowner or a professional, you should know about all the stuff in this updated guidance, because it will save you money, it will save you time, it will avoid surprises, and it will empower you to make the best accessory dwelling units possible. So it's a little wonky, it's a lot to chunk through, clocking in a little over 20,000 words of policy talk, but it's definitely worth knowing. If you don't have time to read the whole handbook yourself, then this video's got my key takeaways, and you can read about those on my blog too. So first of all, the biggest surprise, I was really shocked that they used this example of a 3,000 square foot ADU. In a section where they really simplify the language around size requirements, they have this weird example that they use. The question they ask is, can minimum and maximum unit sizes be established for ADUs? And they say yes, local government can do that under certain things. But then out of nowhere, they say the conversion of an existing accessory structure is not subject to size requirements. For example, an existing 3,000 square foot barn converted to an ADU would not be subject to the size requirements, regardless if a local government has an adopted ordinance. That's wild, right? Like, the example that they went to was, you got a 3,000 square foot barn, you could turn the whole thing into a giant ADU. Now that I've looked at the code again, I see why it's read that way. It's this confusing way that they subdivide the different parts of the regulations, and egg on my face for not realizing it earlier. But now the state government's been really clear, and that means that you can build a big old ADU if you've got an existing building on the property. That's to be clear, that's not going to be a junior ADU, but it does apply to accessory dwelling units. There you go. So that's one of the biggest surprises, literally big surprise. And so I thought I'd throw it in at the front just to give you a taste of what kind of information is in this handbook, so that you know, all right, if you're like that, yeah, Ryan, I've known that for a year, then you might not have to watch the rest of this video. If that's surprising to you, then buckle up, cowboy, buckle up, because there's a lot more surprises like that. I think the biggest takeaway from this whole handbook is this new language around what was actually already pretty clear, but the language is going to be really powerful. They use the phrase statewide exemption ADU. It's not very catchy, but I think it's really clear. What is a statewide exemption ADU? Well, a statewide exemption ADU is an ADU of up to 800 square feet, 16 foot in height, and with 4 foot side and rear yard setbacks. ADU law requires that no lot coverage, floor area ratio, open space, or minimum lot size will preclude the construction of a statewide exemption ADU. Further, ADU law allows the construction of a detached new construction, statewide exemption ADU, to be combined with the JADU within any zone allowing residential or mixed uses regardless of zoning and development standards imposed in an ordinance. See more discussion below. The discussion's in the handbook. So some people live in cities with no ADU ordinance, or counties with no ADU ordinance. And if that's the case, then you use the state code. And the state code is pretty liberal. It's like you can build up to 1,200 square feet as a new detached construction. It can be 16 foot high. it can be as close to the rear and side yard setbacks as 4 feet, and there's no floor area ratio requirements, there's no open space requirements, there's no minimum lot size requirements. It's very liberal. Now, some of you live in cities with ordinances, and those ordinances are allowed to restrict you a bit more than the very liberal state guidelines. But the state guidelines have limits on how restrictive the local ordinances can be. It gets really complicated really quickly, right? So a local agency can have a floor area ratio restriction, but it only applies to ADUs above 800 square feet. So what I've seen is, for example, one subscriber came in and they said, hey, the city is telling me I can't build above 800 square feet. But I want to build a 2-bedroom ADU, and the law says that I can build up to 1,000 square feet if it's a 2-bedroom. And there is a part of the code that says that. It says if you're building a 2-bedroom ADU, you can build up to 1,000 square feet, and that the city can't restrict your size any more than that for a 2-bedroom. But there are other restrictions that the city can put in place that might de facto restrict your size. So the city can say, at 1,000 square feet, you need to respect this floor area ratio, or you need to have some minimum lot size requirements, or some other restrictions like that. And and the homeowner will get confused because they'll say, well, wait, there's this other part of the code that says there are no more floor area ratios or lot size restrictions. And it's like, yeah, but that part of the code only protects you if you're under 800 square feet. So how these laws all interact is a little bit confusing sometimes. And what the statewide exemption ADU does is it says, all right, let's just clear this up. If you're building 800 square feet or less, there can't be any floor area ratios, any open space requirements, any minimum lot size requirements, any lot coverage percentage requirements, and you can go up to 16 feet high with 4-foot side and rear yard setbacks. The end. And that's really clear cut and simple. Now, as soon as you get into higher sizes, if you're in a city or county that wants to be restrictive, then suddenly you get into a lot more complicated, nuanced reading of the code. And if you're in that case, I highly recommend you work with a professional, because you're going to get farther working with somebody with a lot of experience. And I happen to know a guy, right? But if you're under 800, there's a very fair chance that you can get this done on your own, and now you've got this new useful language. The code hasn't changed since January 2020, but you can call it this, it's a statewide exemption ADU. And look, there's this whole handbook from the HCD that talks about how I'm supposed to be able to do this. You're going to start hearing the language statewide exemption ADU because the HCD's chosen to talk about it. And ultimately, the HCD is who enforces whether or not the local agencies are abiding by the state code with their new ordinances. There you go. Statewide exemption ADU. A powerful new phrase to describe the tools in your tool belt. Another really important part of this update from the HCD is that they've clarified some key terms in the granny flat laws that just make things a lot clearer. Proportionately and objective are used a couple times in the regulations, and it's a little fuzzy what they each mean in that context that they're used in. So the HCD's updated the guidance to help cities and counties figure out how they should interpret the wording. So the proportionately example comes up a lot because there's two places, in impact fees and in sanitation water district charges. And I'll use the impact fees as an example. The state code says you can build up to 750 square feet without any impact fees. You're exempt from impact fees. Above 750 square feet, the local agency can start charging you impact fees, but they've got to be proportional to the project and the size of the ADU. and this is where it gets confusing, because it's like, well, proportional how? What's it proportional to? What is the ratio of the proportion? This is more complicated. Why did you word it this way? And so the HCD came out and said, proportionately. It means proportionately is some amount that corresponds to a total amount. In this case, an impact fee for a single family dwelling. For example, a 2,000 square foot primary dwelling with a proposed 1,000 square foot ADU could result in 50% of the impact fee that would be charged for a new primary dwelling on the same site. In all cases, the impact fee for the ADU must be less than the primary dwelling. Otherwise, the fee is not being calculated proportionately. For utilizing proportions, careful consideration should be given to the impacts on cost, feasibility, and ultimately the creation of ADUs. In the case of the example above, anything greater than 50% of the primary dwelling would be considered a constraint on the development of ADUs. And the law exists to not constrain that. So it's the HCD saying, hey, make it proportional to the impact fee you would have charged on the primary dwelling. Make sense? Cool. The other one is there's the word objective comes up a lot in the regulations, and it's pretty important to clarify what that means, because it's usually used in conjunction with the word standards, and it's hard. What standards are objective? What standards are subjective? That is ironically up for subjective debate. So the HCD has clarified, what does objective mean? Objective zoning standards and objective design review standards means standards that involve no personal or subjective judgment by a public official and are uniformly verifiable by reference to an external and uniform benchmark or criterion available and knowable by both the development applicant or proponent and the public official prior to submittal. So what that kind of says is, well, it says a lot. There's a high standard for what counts as objective. Like, there are a lot of clauses in there that the local agency would have to prove. For example, hey, this was uniformly verifiable by reference to an external source or criterion. That external source and criterion were knowable by the development applicant or the proponent and by the public official prior to submittal. And what that eliminates, for example, is do your neighbors like it as a design requirement, right? It is impossible to know if your neighbors at your address will like it or not before submitting. It is also not verifiable. It is subjective. So that's a classic kind of example of the design by committee. No, that's not objective. On the other hand, if you word a regulation like, hey, your ADU has to match the design character of the primary residence, that's a little tougher, right? Like, what that's saying is like, hey, your ADU should look like your house. And if the regulation is worded in a way that says, hey, your ADU should look like your house in the eyes of your neighbors or in the eyes of a design review board, that's not going to fly, because that involves subjective opinion that you can't access ahead of time. On the other hand, if they word it more objectively, like, hey, your ADU should the exterior should match the finish and siding and material and color or design of your existing dwelling, then it's like, oh, okay, my existing dwelling has blue stucco, I should stick to blue stucco. And that's something that you can do more verifiably. Another one of the clarifications that really caught me off guard, and I read about this stuff all the time, was that school district impact fees are being treated differently than other impact fees. If you build an ADU under 750 square feet, you're exempt from impact fees. Impact fees typically include park, school, and other fees that are sort of ministerially levered against projects that will have an impact on the use of those services in the community. When somebody asks me, what are impact fees? I go, oh, they're fees that the city charges when the project is developed. They usually include parks, school fees. Like school fees is one of the go-to examples. And I feel like I've been wrong about that because this document specifically says school districts are authorized to levy impact fees for ADUs greater than 500 square feet. And that's a different limit than what I'm used to seeing, and it's really surprising. So that's another example. In this document, suddenly, I thought anybody building under 750 square feet was completely exempt from impact fees, but it turns out school districts can still opt to charge impact fees, and the state is simply encouraging school districts to reconsider and maybe not charge impact fees. But between 500 and 750, you could get hit with a school impact fee. Another really interesting point is that they go through historic districts and coastal zones specifically in the document. So if you're in a coastal zone, it explains, there's a link to a memo from the Coastal Commission that goes out to all the local planning, the coastal planning agents, explaining how they should update the LCP's regulations to be more in accordance. It's a separate topic that's much deeper, but there's a lot of clarity. You can find it in the link to my blog in the description below. In historic districts, they also acknowledge, the state HCD acknowledges, hey, if you're in a historic district, you do have to mind some extra regulations to stay to avoid an adverse impact on stuff that's listed in the California Register of Historic Resources. And those are good clarifications, and they come up all the time. Those answers have kind of been known, but now it's official in a document, and so that's useful. The next group of updates are kind of clarifications around junior accessory dwelling units. I think in the past, I've talked a lot about how some agencies are allowing you to convert garages into JADUs, and some agencies are saying, no, it has to be a part of the home. It has to include an existing bedroom to be a junior ADU. Well, the state guidance is now official, and it says, hey, garages, JADUs can be converted out of any part of a single-family residence, including an attached garage. State law does not explicitly allow JADUs to be created in detached garages and other detached structures, and that's been clarified too. Now, it's if a local agency wants to allow those, then it still can, but at least it's really clear. An attached garage is supposed to be allowed to be, that's a hard sentence. So it's much clearer now. The law intends for a single-family residence with an attached garage to be able to convert that attached garage into a junior ADU if they want. Now, there's another, so that's a win. There's one that goes in the other direction, which is, I've been reading the code that says that ADUs are allowed to add up to 150 square feet beyond the physical dimensions of the existing accessory structure in order to accommodate ingress and egress, like fancy word for enter or entrance or exit of a building. And actually, the state guidance is that 150 square foot bump out is only allowed for ADUs. It's not allowed for JADUs. So that's an important clarification too. As with all of these things, the local agency can choose to read it more liberally, or it can pass local ordinances that allow you to do things differently. But the state level guidance officially is JADUs don't get the 150 square foot bump out. And the reason I'm confused by this is if you read the legal text, I'll pop it up here. It says the accessory dwelling unit or junior accessory dwelling unit is within the proposed space of a single family dwelling or existing space of a single family dwelling or accessory structure, and may include an expansion of not more than 150 square feet beyond the same physical dimensions as the existing accessory structure. So in my mind, I read that and I thought that junior accessory dwelling units could have a 150 square foot expansion, and that they could be in the proposed space of a of an accessory structure. But the HCD has clarified that actually the ADUs can have 150 square foot bump out or be in an accessory structure. JADUs still have to be within the walls of the single family residence. I'll note that my combo move, JADU plus ADU, which I've talked about in other places, that's still not explicitly ruled out because the accessory dwelling unit could be a single family residence. So we'll talk about that a bit more in other places. Another good clarification is what is considered a multifamily dwelling. So in the ADU regulation, there's different things that you can do if you have a single family. If you have a lot with a single family residence, then there's a bunch of stuff you can do, and it's great. And if you have a lot with a multifamily residence, then there's even more stuff you can do. But I've run into projects where somebody thought that they had a multifamily dwelling, and so they could do all this cool multifamily stuff. But the way that the local agency interpreted it, they said, well, no, you don't have a multifamily dwelling. You have multiple single-family dwellings. And now the state has provided guidance to make it really clear that that is a way that the local agency can interpret it. For the purposes of state ADU law, a structure with 2 or more attached dwellings on a single lot is considered a multifamily dwelling structure. Multiple detached single-unit dwellings on the same lot are not considered multifamily dwellings for the purposes of state ADU law. So if you got 2 houses on one lot, and each single family, you don't have a multifamily dwelling. You still get to build an ADU and a JADU. You just don't get to do all the cool stuff that multifamily dwelling properties get to do. And there's some clarification around enforcement, because why does the HCD's opinion matter when you are applying for a permit with a local planning department? The inspections are executed by a local planning and building department and fire department. The charges that you're being levied are from local school districts, sanitation districts. So what's the enforcement mechanism? Why does the HCD matter? Because the HCD is the enforcement mechanism. So after adoption of an ordinance, the HCD can review and submit written findings to the local agency as to whether the ordinance complies with state law. And if the local agency's ordinance does not comply, the HCD must provide a reasonable time for the local agency to respond, and the local agency shall consider the findings to amend the ordinance to become compliant within 30 days. If a local agency does not make changes and implements an ordinance that is not compliant with state law, HCD may refer the matter to the Attorney General. So yeah, this is, again, you never want to fight City Hall, but if you're in a place where the rules aren't being enforced in the spirit of what the HCD guidance says, then you could say, hey, planning department, I don't get it. Like, this is the official document from the HCD. It says this and this and this. Can you tell me why you're going against this? And like, have you had the conversation with? Has the HCD seen your ordinance? Do they understand that you're doing this to me and other homeowners? And see where the conversation goes. If the local ordinance has been approved by the HCD, then you should go to the HCD and say, like, why do you guys approve this local ordinance? If it hasn't been approved, then you tell your local agency, like, hey, you gotta run this up to the HCD. I'm doing things by the book, by my interpretation of the code, and I would like to insist. Or you can pivot and say, well, I don't mind changing my plan. I don't mind paying the fee if it gets me my project done on time and promptly. Either way, now you at least know what the enforcement mechanism would be. That's a taste of the kind of power you get from plowing into these documents, keeping up to date with both the state code, the literal code, the local code and ordinances, and then the updated guidance, right? And so subscribe to the channel. I'll always keep you in the loop on changes, updates, and I'll empower you to build the best ADUs you can build. There's a lot in here. Every page is kind of dense with information. And so if you want more information about ADU and granny flat regulations, check out this playlist. Share this video with anybody who would be interested, and thank you for watching.